Hello, I'm Dr. Gabrielle Heffernan. I'm the Assistant Curator of Designated Collections at Hull Museums, and I'm also an Egyptologist. I'm here at Hands on History, where I'm going to be talking about the Egyptian collections as part of our Spotlight On season. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about death and the afterlife in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians had a very detailed understanding of what they thought the afterlife would be like, and they took a lot of time and a lot of effort preparing for the afterlife to make sure that they would achieve the death they wanted and the afterlife they wanted, and that when they were there they would get to do what they wanted to do. And a lot of the objects that they left behind help us to understand in a little more detail what it was they thought the afterlife would be like. One of the objects in our collection is this beautiful funerary boat. It's a wooden model of a boat, and it was excavated in the early 1900s at a site called Beni Hassan, which is in central Egypt. It was excavated by an Egyptologist called John Garstang, and he found it in what we call a shaft tomb. Now, in this context, a shaft tomb is basically where the Egyptians have dug several meters vertically down into the ground, and then at the bottom of this long shaft they've created a small room, and in the small room they put a coffin and then a few other objects with the deceased, again, as I said, to help them in the afterlife. Now, I think the first thing that this really tells us is how much effort they put into this, because to dig several meters into the ground and then not only to create a space at the bottom, but then to take a coffin into that space would have taken a huge amount of effort. So I think we can definitely see that the Egyptians really cared about preparing for the afterlife. The boat was found with the coffin, as I said, but also alongside several other models. So we also found models of a granary, a bakery, and there were also another boat and small figures or figurines carrying food offerings on their shoulders. These all again help us to understand more about the Egyptian view of the afterlife. And if we look in a bit more detail at the boat, this tells us not only about what they thought the afterlife would be like, but how they got to the afterlife. So for your average Egyptian living 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, they often lived along the sides of the Nile, a huge river running obviously through Egypt, and for them boats were a very common form of transport. They took goods across the Nile, up and down the river, they took people, they carried most things, and they were vital. So it stands to reason that the Egyptians would have believed that in order to get to the afterlife they might need to use a boat. So they very much had this idea that getting to the afterlife was very similar to getting somewhere in this life. You needed to take a boat with you and you then use that to row. And if we look in more detail at the boat, we can see at the back of the boat there is a man holding a rudder, and he's steering the boat, making sure it gets to where it should go. And then the men in front of him are rowers, and originally they had oars, and they would have rowed. So the deceased would have used this boat to make sure they got to the afterlife. And again, we can see the detail that went into this. These weren't objects that were just made quickly and thrown into a tomb. They were made with care, and they would have cost a good amount of expense or money. And to the owner, they were probably quite treasured. And if you look at the details on these figures, they're beautifully carved, they have painted decoration, their eyes, they even have eyeliner around their eyes. So they're valuable objects and they're valued. But the journey to the afterlife wasn't an easy one. The Egyptians would have encountered various tests, various challenges on their way to the next world. And again, this wasn't left to chance. So the Egyptians would often have chosen to wrap various amulets or magical objects into their mummy wrappings to help to protect them on the journey. And one of these would potentially have been a small heart amulet. And again, we have one of these in our collection here. And these amulets would have been wrapped ideally close to the heart, because the heart was believed to be the source of life. The brain wasn't thought to be important, it was removed at mummification, but the heart was the centre of the life. And so protecting the heart on the journey to and in the afterlife was vital. It's a red amulet, and red also symbolised life and rebirth, so it's a very symbolic colour. And this very tiny amulet is one of many that would have helped to protect the deceased through these challenges and tests that they would have had to endure in order to get to the afterlife. And then when they reached the afterlife, again, they prepared. So they didn't assume they would get there and life would be good. They took objects with them. I've already mentioned that the funerary boat was found in a tomb with various other objects, and these were for the afterlife. So the granary that was found, the small model of a granary, that would have helped to provide bread in the afterlife, as with the bakery. The offering bringers carrying food, that would have helped to feed the deceased. And they also took another object with them, which may be more familiar to many people, and this are these very small figurines of people, which we call Shabtis. And again, we have these in our collection, and these are essentially models of people who would act as servants or helpers in the afterlife. And they had the name of their owner on them, and they had spells on them to help the Shabti and ensure the Shabti would carry out tasks. So they might be asked to plough the fields, or bring in the harvest, or fill water channels, all the kind of jobs that Egyptians would have done in this life, and that ideally they didn't want to have to do in the next life. So they would take helpers with them, and these again would be buried in the tomb with the deceased. So what these objects really tell us is that the Egyptians didn't leave things to chance when it came to the afterlife. One of the most important things in this life was ensuring that you were prepared for the next world. Not everyone could afford the kind of objects that we have in our museums or the kind of tombs that we see, but that's what they would have aspired to. The afterlife could be a wonderful place, and it was a beautiful place to live, but if you weren't properly prepared, it actually instead could be quite unwelcoming, quite terrifying, and if you were really unlucky, you might not even get there. If you want to come and discover the collections for yourselves, Hands on History is open on the 2nd and the 4th Saturday of every month.